In the previous video, I explained why architecturally you would want to relegate all of your transact SQL into stored procedures. And so with that groundwork laid, now I'm going to focus on the syntax and the techniques for creating, updating, deleting, executing stored procedures. We're going to look at how to execute a stored procedure using a transact SQL ad hoc query from within a new query window. And finally, we're going to talk about naming conventions, and I'm sure we'll throw some other topics in along the way. So let's go ahead and get started. We're using the same database that we used in day 7, that Acme database, so hopefully you still have access to that. You didn't delete it or anything crazy like that. You'll recall that it has a customers table and orders table, order items, and so on. So hopefully you can get back to that. Okay, so what I want to do is create a new query. And here I'm going to type in the syntax, the basic syntax for creating a new stored procedure, which is pretty easy, right? It's just procedure, create procedure, and then I'm going to give it a name, just like I do a method in C#. So in this case, it's going to be get customer list. And then we're going to define this as, and then I'm going to use this begin end syntax. And this is just like the curly brace syntax in C#. It just defines a code block. Okay. And then within that code block, I'm going to type in the actual SQL statement that I want to execute whenever somebody calls our stored proc. Now we can have multiple SQL statements inside of this, just like we can have multiple C# statements within a C# method. So think about that equivalent of a C# method and a SQL Server stored procedure, and I think you're going to find there's a lot of equivalent between the two. Okay, so here we're just going to do something simple. Select star from customers. Nothing too outlandish. Now that we've written this syntax, we need to execute it so that it creates a new stored procedure database object in our database. So I'm going to click the execute button, and you'll get the message command completed successfully. If not, if you had some syntax mistakes, it will alert you to those. You'll have an opportunity to change those before it actually creates the object. So at this point, that's all we see on the screen. You might be thinking to yourself, well, where's all the customers? Well, we didn't actually execute the stored procedure. All we did was just write a method that says, when you do execute a stored procedure, this particular one, do this. So now we have to go about the task of executing that stored procedure. So I'm going to create a new query window, and here I'm going to type in exec get customer list, and then I'll click the execute button. And if you did this right, you'll see all 1,000 rows of data from our customers table. All right, so let's do this. Let's take a look and see in the Object Explorer for our database where the stored procedure lives. Here's our tables, and you can see all these database objects. Stored procedures are database objects too. We just have to drill down on a different place to find them. In the Programmability folder, under Stored Procedures, if we click on it, we may need to refresh our Object Explorer window since we just created a new object. But you should be able to see this Get Customer List. And I believe we right-click it, we can select Execute Stored Procedure. It pops up this little window that would allow us to input any parameters. We'll talk about those in the next video. And I'll click OK. And so it does execute the stored procedure, as you can see here in this window. All right. There are some other things that we can do from this contextual menu. For example, we can script out a stored procedure as a create or an alter or a drop. And you might be thinking to yourself, what's all that about? Give me one moment, we'll come right back to that. But let's say, for example, you want to create a stored procedure and you don't remember the create procedure syntax, or there's some additional options that you want to add to a stored procedure. You want to create a more complicated example than what we've done here. Well, so each of us need some refresher once in a while to remember some of the syntax for a lot of this stuff. Not a big deal. What you can do is go right-click on the stored procedure folder and select new stored procedure, and it creates a template for a new stored procedure. It adds a lot of extra stuff that simply we don't need. Nice to have. For example, notice here that there's this comment at the top, this template generated from the Template Explorer using Create Procedure New Menu. We'll talk about the Template Explorer some other time. But at any rate, you can then Specify values for the template parameters by hitting Control-Shift-M to fill in the parameter values below. So you see some of these things here, like author, create date, description, procedure name, parameter type and parameter name. Here's a column name and so on. Those are all input parameters or parameter values that we can fill in for this template by using this Control-Shift-M. I'm not going to demonstrate that right now. You can experiment with that on your own. What I'm going to do is just go ahead and delete all of this. We don't need this. There are also some meta settings, I guess you'd say, on our stored procedures that we can set. ANSI nulls, quoted identifier, it's turning those flags on. For our purposes right now, we don't need those. Let's just ignore that and table that discussion for another time. Here's a little block of comment on top of the create stored procedure statement. And what we would use this for is to document the purpose and who originally authored the stored procedure. So sometimes when you work in a large environment and you have several people working on the same project at the same time, it's helpful to know who originally created a given block of code and why they created it. Additionally, it's helpful to keep track of who made changes and why they made changes and the date they made changes so that you can trace back any problems that may have popped up during a certain date range and ascertain why are we now experiencing this issue that we never had before. Oh, well, it's because Jim made a change in the code here and you can get back to it. So code blocks, great idea. For now, we're going to delete all that. So we're now back to just the create procedure. We can just remove this template area. We haven't talked about parameters yet for our stored procedures. We'll delete all of that. We'll talk about that in the next video. Here's a no count statement that would allow you to eliminate a return of the exact count of rows that were retrieved or affected by the query. Metadata that comes back whenever you execute a query statement, you can say, don't give me that information. And so that's what the no count statement is doing. I'm going to delete that for now as well. All right, and then finally we get here to just a simple select statement, and we can rewrite that. So really, if you just need help with remembering the create procedure as the beginning and the end, then you can use the template like I just demonstrated here. Just right click, new stored procedure. Okay, let's shut that down. A moment ago I said there are a bunch of different options here for scripting stored procedures, and that would give us an opportunity to talk about why would you ever want to script a stored procedure. Let me show you what this does. Here, let me just close all of our query windows, and I don't want to save any of this for the moment. And by saving that, I'm just saving a script, which we'll talk about right now. All right, say for example, I wanted to script a stored procedure as a create to, and we'll select new query window, but you could script it to a file or to the clipboard or to an agent, which is a little bit more of an advanced topic. But let's just script it to a new query window. We'd be able to see the basic syntax of our get customer list. Now, admittedly, it looks a little bit different. We have this DBO dot, which I don't want to talk about that just yet. Let's table that. And then this select star from customers. It's the basic syntax for the stored procedure that we created. There's some other things here like this ANSI nulls and quoted identifier again. We see, get out of here, right? It has a using statement, which database it should execute this against. So you might be wondering, why do you need this scripting of a stored procedure? Why is that an option in this contextual menu? And there's a couple of reasons why you would want to script out not just a stored procedure, but just about any database object like tables and triggers and so on. First of all, you would probably develop tables, stored procedures, and other database objects on a development instance of SQL Server. In other words, there may be a live SQL Server machine that's running for your company's live website or in their live production environment that's used internally within their internal LAN. Eventually, you want to take what you're developing and you want to move that to the production environment. You don't do your development work out there, you do it locally on your own machine, and then at some point you want to move that work into a production environment so that all the end users can benefit from it. And there might be a couple of interim steps like a staging environment to just one last test before we move it into production. But you probably develop all your database objects, tables, stored procedures, on a development instance of SQL Server, and eventually you want to execute those scripts against a database that's running production code, meaning that you want those database objects to be available to the end users and the applications. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Well, I guess you could make a backup copy of the entire database that you created on your development machine, and then you could restore it on the production server. And certainly some people choose to go that route. However, when you script this process, you can take a look at the script. You can inspect the script. You can tweak the script and generally feel more in control of that process of creation of these database objects in your production environment. So also you may need to make small modifications to an existing database, and it's easier to script those changes and test that script against a staging or a development environment. And that could be just adding a new stored procedure or updating existing stored procedures, testing them in a development environment or a staging environment before implementing them on the production server, where it might have an adverse impact if something was incorrect. And finally, you can use scripted Transact SQL files as a means of versioning your database. You can store any code into a source code repository, also known as source control, that keeps track of the changes to your code that you've made over time. So in this way, you can look at the evolution of your C# code, or in this case, your database's structure or the database objects like the stored procedures. You can look at the changes you've made to them over time. So those are just the benefits that come to mind off the top of my head. I'm sure there are others. For more information on creating and restoring backups of SQL Server, you can see our other website, trainingspot.com. At a future date of this recording, I'll have an entire workshop on using source control. In the meantime, you can take a look at our archive videos here on learnvisualstudio.net and learn about Microsoft's entry-level source control product called SourceSafe. Okay, so at any rate, that's why you would want to script a stored procedure, why you want to work with the scripts as opposed to working with them in the Object Explorer. I guess that's what it all comes down to. Okay, so what if you wanted to make a change to this stored procedure? Say it's bringing back all customers and you only want to bring back those customers from Illinois. So what you can do is right-click and select Script Stored Procedure as Alter to a new query window, a query editor window. And so what I can do here is then get into this and say where state equals Illinois. All right, so now I'm going to execute that. And I do get a little syntax error here. I got an extra one of those in there. So you can see there's an example of not being able to make a change because there's a syntax error. Let's execute again. Now that I made the change and it looks like it's successful, let's go ahead and exec get customer list and hit Control E on my keyboard. And you can see now we're only pulling back those from the state of Illinois. Awesome. Okay, so I think there was something else I wanted to say about that, but let's move on. Oh yeah, let's take a look at this. So let's take, for example, this. I've already created a stored procedure with this name. I'm going to try and create it a second time, and let's see what error message we get. It says there's already an object named getCustomerList in the database. So that's the difference between a create and an alter. An alter will let you continue. I am refreshing the database object a dozen times here, and nothing changed, but it'll complete successfully each time. Just be aware that just like updates in a database, an alter statement is destructive. It's going to overwrite the previous version of your stored procedure. And so all the changes that you had, all the code that you had in there previously will be irrevocably changed for the worse, potentially, if you weren't paying attention. All right, so what if you wanted to delete your stored procedure? Let's do this real quick. Let's create a second version for fun. So I'm going to do this version 2. So now I should have 2 stored procedures. And the only difference is that I have a V2 here because I want to show you how to go about deleting it. There's a couple of ways to do this. Let's just use the script stored procedure as drop to new query window. And so notice what happens here. This is the meat of the stored procedure, or of the statement here. Drop procedure. So we have create, alter, drop. Those are keywords in SQL that allow you to deal with database objects, in this case, procedures, stored procedures. So that's what we get here. But notice that there's an if statement on top. What? Transient SQL can have if statements? Yeah, there's a whole programming language. You have switch statements and all kinds of stuff. Again, that's a little bit more advanced. But anyway, you can kind of make sense of what's going on here. If the get customer v2 exists in a table called sysObjects, which is an internal table that SQL uses to manage your database objects. So it uses that internally to know which database objects are within the database. Kind of a strange notion, but it has several hidden system databases for various purposes, like keeping track of all of your database objects. So if you can find a stored procedure called getCustomer v2, and the type is a procedure, okay, then go ahead and execute this statement of code, drop procedure. So let's go ahead and execute that, and when we do, if we were to refresh our Object Explorer here, hopefully, yes, it would go away. Great. So we no longer have that second version of our stored procedure. There's another way to do this, a little bit simpler. If you're only going to use the Object Explorer and you don't need to script out your dropping procedure, then I think you can just select delete, or select it and then hit the delete key on your keyboard. Okay, so that brings us to one of our final topics here, and that is naming conventions. So you'll notice that I named this get customer list. I did that on purpose. It's important to pay attention to how you name your stored procedures, just like it's important to pay attention to how you name your C# methods. Using a convention will help you ascertain quickly the purpose of a given method or stored procedure, and will help to communicate to others what you foresaw as the purpose for that stored procedure. So if you're starting a new job or a new project, I'd recommend that you blend in and not rock the boat. So if that group that you're working with is already using a naming convention, then you should follow it even if you don't like it. So what I do is this. For those select statements or those stored procedures that will primarily be creating a select or a group of selects, I use the word get. If it's getting a single item, then I'll not use a plural word. So if I wanted to create, for example, a get customer, I might name it like that. And so I might use an input parameter where customer ID equals 5. Okay. If I was getting a list, I would get either customer list, or I could just do get customers. Okay. And then I would probably do an insert customer. If I was going to create a stored procedure that was just going to do an insert, I would do a update or edit customer if I was doing an update stored proc, and then I would do a delete customer. So I'd use that naming convention. So I use get, insert, update, delete. But again, it's important to blend into whatever your particular organization is using. And I believe that consistency should always win out over your personal preferences or your personal taste. In the past, there was a common convention, just to kind of let you know this, and it's not used so much anymore. At least I haven't seen it as much. Developers would use this like SP underscore, and that would indicate stored procedure delete customer as opposed to a table, for example. Some people would even do USP underscore for a user stored procedure as opposed to a system-wide stored procedure. And there are stored procedures, just like there are tables in SQL Server, that were created by Microsoft for various internal purposes for managing and executing things. And you could call those, they're just not stored procedures that you created. They're methods and essentially classes or APIs that SQL Server team created for managing and working with data. Okay. I've also seen a prefix used to denote which application has added the stored procedure. So, for example, I'm using I'm currently working with a content management system called Sitefinity. It's by Telerik, and it's awesome. And if you look at their stored procedures that they add to a database, and they're not destructive, they don't require their own database. They use this SF underscore for Sitefinity to denote that this is a stored procedure that they added, not one of your stored procedures that you may have added to the application. And so this is great because I don't have to wade through 200 stored procedures to find out which ones were the ones that Sitefinity are used as opposed to ones that I've created personally or some other project created. So as with all things in programming and in life, the situation and your goals dictate what the right answer is for naming conventions. Now, I prefer to keep things consistent and simple because it reduces confusion. If there's already a standard in place, however, always use that. If not, then develop your own, or you can borrow the little simple convention that I used here on what standard that you want to follow when you use it when you create new projects. Okay, so that wraps up the basic tasks of creating, updating, deleting, and executing stored procedures. We looked at templates. We talked about naming conventions. We want to build on this in the next video, where we're going to get into a slightly more advanced scenario of passing parameters into and retrieving parameters from the stored procedures that you create. Just like what you can do, again, with C# methods. You can make them void, or you can retrieve values from them. You can make them with no parameters, or you can add input parameters. Same idea with stored procedures, and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you.